Good afternoon, friends. I am Peter Vedanayamani, a faculty member at Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. I'm so delighted that you are able to join us this afternoon for a very meaningful time of learning together about what God is calling us in our time to do. I'm happy that our Dean, Professor Esterman, is with us, the Dean of LSTC. May I invite her to say a word of welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Scherer Lecture. It's so good to see so many people gathered here together from near and far. Today, Zoom is our friend because we have so many that are able to be here with us. My name is Esther Men, as Peter said, Dr. Vedanayamani said, and I'm Dean of Academic Affairs at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. So it's my privilege and my honor to welcome you, to bring greetings from LSTC, and if I may, also from our sister seminaries, McCormick Theological Seminary and Catholic Theological Union, who are so important in this event today. I want to note a few things about the Scherer Lecture itself. The Scherer Lecture is an annual event that goes back to the early 1990s, and it's funded through the Eleanor and Arnold Scherer Endowment Fund that was generously endowed by the Scherer family. And in connection with this, I would like to highlight that today we have on the call at this event, we have Dr. Jim Scherer and his wife, Leanne Sorensen. And we should take a moment to acknowledge that earlier this month, Dr. Scherer celebrated his 95th birthday. So happy birthday, Jim. We are so delighted to be able to spend this landmark time with you. May this year bring health, peace, and joy. Now, one of the special joys of the Scherer Lecture is that it brings together the communities of LSTC, McCormick, and CTU, the three seminaries that sponsor this event. These schools have a long and close association that's witnessed in the collaborative planning for this event and in our annual gathering. And I'd like to remark that in our conversation before this event, it was noted that several of the organizers are former students of Dr. Scherer. So we are witnessing a long and fruitful legacy that continues to this day. I'm certainly looking forward to today's lecture, and so without delay, I'll turn this back to Dr. Vedanayamani. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Men, for your gracious words of welcome. And as Dr. Men mentioned, we are so delighted Dr. Scherer is able to join us today. What a joyful thing it is for us that he is with us today. So may I invite him to bring a word of greetings to the gathering now? Dr. Scherer.
Thank you, Peter. It is a joy to be here and to join you all for the annual Scherer Lecture. And it is an honor to bear the name of Scherer, although the lecture itself is given in the name of my parents, who were wonderful Christian individuals living in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This lectureship intends to call attention to the centrality of the global mission of the church for the church in our time, not just for in times past, for example, in the colonial ages, but even now, as there are hundreds of thousands of people who have not heard the gospel and who have not accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. So we dedicate this lecture to the glory of God, and we thank especially our good friend George Hansberger, whom I have known for a number of years and whom I honor and respect for the many accomplishments that he has shown as our principal speaker today. He is located in Holland, Michigan. We are in various locations, but we come together in the name of the Lord and through the power of the Holy Spirit and the mystery of technology, which I don't pretend to understand. So thank you very much for coming, and I wish you all a great blessing from hearing this lecture today.
Thank you, Dr. Scherer, for those kind words. And you reminded us that we are talking about what God is calling us today to do. So it is a good reminder. Thank you so very much. And we are so privileged to have Dr. Roger Schrader, who is part of this planning committee. He is the Dean of Catholic Theological Union. May I invite him to introduce the speaker to us, and following his introduction, may I invite Dr. Hansberger to deliver the lecture. Following the lecture, I'm inviting Dr. Ken Sawyer to lead us in the Q&A. And when you have a question, please use the chat to convey your question. Dr. Ken Sawyer will moderate the conversation. Dr. Roger Schrader, please introduce the speaker.
Good. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm really glad to be a part of this today, and it's really an honor for me to introduce George Hansberger. He's a good friend and colleague over many years, and it's really an honor for me to introduce him today. George was born in Pennsylvania. He spent most of his early years in Miami, Florida, skipping over many years. He then got a doctorate degree from Princeton Theological Seminary in 1987 in the field of ecumenics, missiology, and history of religions. In his own doctoral work focused on Leslie Newbigin's theology of cultural plurality. As many of us know, he's a real expert in Leslie Newbigin's work. So it's really great to have you with us, George. He was professor of missiology at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, since 1989. He officially retired in 2014, but as he told me before the talk tonight, he's still very busy with teaching and mentoring people and involved in many different projects. And of course, that's what good people do in retirement, how they continue on with their passions in that way as things come. And I have no doubt that you contribute much in that way, George. He is a ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. He has many publications. I'd just like to mention a couple. He's author of Bearing the Witness of the Spirit and co-author of Missional Church and Treasure in Clay Jars. Very significantly also, he founded and coordinated the Gospel and Our Culture Network in North America from 1987 to 2010. This is a very significant contribution that you've made, George, for us here in the US and beyond that as well. It's very significant, the work that you have done, and I know that we are familiar with that. So George is a very good colleague and friend of mine through ASM, through the Midwest Fellowship, and now through the IBMR, and our paths seem to cross in different ways. Before COVID, personally in different ways, and now through Zoom, and now we're able to do this. So George Hansberger will be delivering a lecture on 3 innovators in mission: Lamin Sani, Leslie Newbigin, and Dorothy Day. So we look forward to hearing your words, George. Welcome.
Thank you for your introduction, Roger. And it is an honor to me to wear the label of the Scherer Lecturer. Jim Scherer, you were a very kind friend to me when I first began to be a part of the Missiology Guild through the American Society of Missiology. And your work also played significant roles in my own formation as a missiologist. Thank you for that. If I may make a personal comment before I begin my lecture. While preparing this lecture during recent months, I've been acutely aware that in short order, death has taken from us 4 of our valued and loved companions. April 27, Rene Padilla. June 1, Robert Schreider. July 13, Wilbert Schenk. August 12, Andrew Walls. Rest from all your labors, dear friends. It is in the strength and spirit of your work that we move ahead with our own. The organizers of this lecture have invited me, and now you, to consider an important angle of reflection: innovation in the practice of mission. In a moment, I will talk about what I mean by innovation as I proceed, but I also will begin by introducing you to the other part of the invitation. I trust that you see the pictures of these three friends. The invitation asked me to explore three persons that I consider to be innovators in the practice of mission. They suggested a couple of people to me as possibilities, and I have embraced the committee's suggestions. Those were Lamin Sana and LESSLIE NEWBIGIN. Not only did the organizers suggest them as people who seemed to them to be worthy examples of innovation in the practice of mission, but they knew me well enough to know that I have given appreciative attention to their work. These may be no-brainers to you as well. I can hardly imagine that courses in missiology you have either taken or taught do not include some reference to their work. But faced with the need to choose a third person, which by their wise guidance should not be another male, I reflected on many female colleagues in the Missiology Guild who came to mind. However, I was somehow drawn to consider the work of Dorothy Day. Although at the time I knew only a little about her work, I had a hunch that there would be plenty of innovation to find there. And I had a sense that her work was located squarely in the practice of mission. Even though I had not seen that expressed directly by her or by folks in the Missiology Guild. To put that in another way, I can hardly imagine that those courses in missiology you have either taken or taught do make reference to Dorothy Day or the Catholic worker. My sense is that she has not been on the radar of the Mission Studies Academy as making a substantial contribution, nor has her particular form of life and work seemed to count for much as mission. In fact, I suspect she might have been hesitant to have her work described by that label, or at least surprised. In any case, these facts serve to heighten my interest in choosing her as the third innovator. It also set me on a considerable reading adventure these last 4 or 5 months.
Good.
The idea of innovation, the Collins English Dictionary might be a place to start, and its definition has companionship with others offered in both dictionaries and academic treatments of the idea. Innovation, it says, is the introduction of new ideas, methods, or things, to which I would want quickly to add the nuance of practices. I will proceed using this definition, presuming the following notes and/or amendments. 1, it has to do with something new, though nothing is conceivably entirely new out of thin air. But the American sociologist Everett Rogers puts it this way: an idea, practice, or object that is perceived as new by an individual or other unit of adoption. Dan McClure offers a simple utilitarian definition of innovation in an essay dated March of 2015. But simply new is not enough. People care about innovation because it offers important answers to critical business challenges. Innovation must be more than clever. It must be useful in a meaningful way. Thirdly, an innovation either has been or is being introduced. It is not merely an idea, but is something injected, infused into a system of thought or activity. It is put into the field of ideas, methods, or things that are of the area of concern. It implies diffusion, adoption, implementation. And fourthly, it is not very likely that anyone ever sets out to think up something new. So if you're interested in learning how to be an innovator, make a long journey similar to the journeys of these three. Innovation happens within the disciplines of a community of practice, and it arrives as a discovery on the way. Based on these understandings of the term, I will make the case that each of these three people has been an innovator in the practice of mission. Time is not available to deal with the innovation of each in its many dimensions, so a brief sketch will have to suffice. I will rely on any previous familiarity you have with them and their work. And I rely on your curiosity to go and find the rest of the story. Here, I will trace very briefly what I take to be a substantial innovation in the practice of mission which each one has introduced. Lamin Sana, translatability. Lamin Sana's innovation in the practice of mission can be captured in that single word. To move from the word translate to translatable to translatability is no great leap within the lexicon of the English language. So Sana's term translatability would not exactly be considered a neologism. However, the studies and mission theory make it very nearly a neologism. The way he infuses it with meaning is a pace-setting innovation that transforms imagination and practice. In the Concise Dictionary of the Christian World Mission, published in 1971, edited by Stephen Neal and others, there are entries for translation, Bible translations and versions, but not for translatability. In the Evangelical Dictionary of World Missions, published in the year 2000, edited by Moreau and Company, there are expanded entries for Bible translation, and translation theory, plus a new addition to the lexicon, a brief one on translatability. And as luck would have it, when I went to visit the entry, I discovered that I was the one who authored it. Go figure. Now I come back to what I had authored. I begin with this tightly packed dictionary style definition. So I invite you to listen to it. I'll go slowly. A concept introduced and explored by Lamin Sana, the notion of translatability indicates the process by which the Christian message shows its capacity to enter each cultural idiom and convince their challenging and enduring dialogue. This deepens the notion of translation to something more than merely substituting words or grammar from one language for words and structures from another. It suggests there is something in the Christian faith evident from the New Testament onwards that renders it compatible with all cultures. The genius of the Christian religion is its ability to, in Sana's words, to adopt each culture as its natural destination and as a necessity of its life. In that entry, I went on to note two important implications or consequences of his view. One is that every culture is relativized. None may be justifiably absolutized as the final form of Christian faith and life. The missionary church has no monopoly on the form of faith required in the receptor culture. The second implication is that every culture is revitalized by its hearing of the gospel in its vernacular. It is destigmatized. It is treated not as inferior or untouchable, but as the proper instrument for the expression of the divine message. In the mid-1990s, I had a front row seat watching a student from Singapore encounter Sane's groundbreaking notion of translatability. Both Paul Satari and his wife Pauline were of Malay Muslim descent and rearing, and had become Christ followers in their early adult life. Paul was at that time on the pastoral staff of Trinity Methodist Church in Singapore, with particular responsibility for the coordination and facilitation of relationships with numerous missionaries who had gone out from that church to places across South and Southeastern Asia. He came for advanced studies in Western Theological Seminary's Master of Theology degree program, which by then had been refocused to give special attention to local contextual theologizing. For his THM thesis, Paul explored Sane's work, arguing that Sane's notion of translatability is what he called a powerful model for doing theology in Singapore. It is a powerful model which can clarify complex theological realities, help analyze and interpret history, and enhance various forms of contextual theology. From where I sat as Paul's advisor, I was intrigued by the resonance between Sane's notion and Paul's context in Southeast Asia. It confirmed for me that Sane's perspective, while it developed within the African context, had such a resounding fit with other parts of the globe as well. It is not just an African thing, as some have accused. It confirmed that what I now would call an innovation was being embraced. Paul's embrace highlighted a dimension of Sane's view that had not yet struck me with its full force. It was not only about the translatability of Christianity, it was also about the residue of colonialism and the historic relationships between mission and colonialism. Paul's background in Islam, paralleling Sane's, and his location in a multicultural, multilingual place in the former empire made the connections close and personal for him. Sane interpreted his context for him, an innovation introduced and received. Sane is not merely stating the obvious. Yes, the Christian scriptures are texts, just like other texts, that bear the quality of translatability. That is, they are able to be translated into a different language from their original writing. Able translators of any text know that the process is much more intricate than a simple, straightforward word equivalence or word order. A studied deftness on the part of the translator will make the difference between an effective translation and a deficient one. At least one of the goals is that the translation be doubly true, true to the original language and true to the one into which its message enters. Sane's assertion about translatability is about something even more. It is not about the text so much as it is about the Christianity for which particular texts are its origin and mooring. Christianity itself not only welcomes, but begs for its sacred texts to come to be articulated in every human vernacular. Something innate to the character of Christianity anticipates taking up residence in every vernacular as its natural and authentic home. The opening paragraph in Sane's influential book, Translating the Message, 1989, shows this dynamic as present from the outset. He says, the central thesis of this book is that from its origins, Christianity identified itself with the need to translate out of Aramaic and Hebrew, and from that position came to exert a dual force in its historical development. One part of that was to resolve to relativize its Jewish roots, with the consequence that it promoted significant aspects of those roots. The other part was the destigmatization of Gentile culture by adopting that culture as a natural extension of the life of the new religion. This action to destigmatize complemented the other action to relativize. Extending this destigmatizing effect on every culture and the de-absolutizing effect on all cultures, Sane emphasizes both inclusion and change as the consequences of vernacular translation. He explains, two general ideas stem from this description. The first is the inclusive principle whereby no culture is excluded from the Christian dispensation or even judged solely or ultimately by Western cultural criteria. The second is the ethical principle of change as a check on cultural chauvinism. Sane cuts to the chase when he says, translation is the church's birthmark as well as its missionary benchmark. The church would be unrecognizable or unsustainable without it. Sane's personal background in Islam, as well as his studied appreciation of its core character, alerts him to differences between Islam and Christianity in this regard. Itself a globe-spanning missionary faith, Islam nonetheless holds that its sacred text, the Quran, is non-translatable. Its Arabic language of origin remains essential to its identity as the Book of Allah, the sacred book of Islam. There are today renderings of the Quran, translations of it, we might be tempted to think, in many other languages. But to Islam, these are not the Quran, but are considered to be interpretations of it, attempts to understand the message of the Book of Allah. This is in sharp contrast to Christianity's fundamental translatability. Recognizing the translatability of Christianity provides a lens by which Sane can give an accounting of Christianity's history. His book, Disciples of All Nations, Pillars of World Christianity, is an example. He also enables a clearer interpretation of the flourishing of Christianity's presence and growth across the world today in places beyond the West. The key lies in a fundamental shift of perspective, away from missionary heroism and unilateral transmission to indigenous appropriation and mutual solidarity. There are language issues when we choose or assume how to talk about the recent explosion of Christianity in the non-Western world. Sane decidedly prefers the language of world Christianity over the language of global Christianity. The latter, he claims, refers to the faithful replication of Christian forms and patterns developed in Europe. World Christianity, on the other hand, refers to the movement of Christianity as it takes form and shape in societies that previously were not Christian, where Christianity was received and expressed through cultures, customs, and traditions of the people affected. Christianities, plural, might be the proper word, for there is a radical pluralism, Sane claims, associated with vernacular translation, wherein all languages and cultures, wherein all those languages and cultures are in principle equal in expressing the word of God. Then there is the dilemma akin to the one which European origin peoples in the Americas are now facing. Who discovered whom? In this case, Sane commends a reversal in our thinking by speaking of the indigenous discovery of Christianity rather than the Christian discovery of indigenous societies. It matters who you think is the subject of the action of discovery. By these moves, Sane calls into place a post-colonial way of framing world Christianity, and with it shifts our models of mission to correspond. Both are works in progress for the churches of the West, whose thinking he calls into question. His is an innovation introduced into the academy and the structures of missionary enterprise pressing for change. Next, LESSLIE NEWBIGIN, The Gospel and Western Culture. The idea that there might be something new, innovative in Newbigin's work of a lifetime got me stumbling at first when I was invited to speak about it. He said a lot of things that were fresh, maybe somewhat new. My book on his theology of cultural plurality notes a few of those, including his missionary sense of election, for example. But would any of these rise to the significance of an innovation in the practice of mission? And if so, which would I choose to commend as such? Struggling to find the new and innovative in Newbigin, I came across an old issue of the Gospel in Our Culture newsletter, the one which honored Newbigin just after his death in 1998. I read again what I had heard Dan Beebe, his close companion, say at Newbigin's funeral. And there it was. Dan Beebe. LESSLIE never touched anything that he did not adorn, illuminate, and advance. His influence before 1983 was enormous, but with the book, The Other Side of 1984, and its successors, I believe there was something totally new, long roots, but new. A new mission for a new cultural situation, a new analysis, new eyes for us to see with, an old faith renewed, and a new and proper confidence born. In a faltering age with hope run low, he swung the lamp of resurrection over increasing gloom. Thus far, Dan Beebe. This is the innovation of Newbigin I wish to speak about, his pursuit of a genuinely missionary encounter of the gospel with our modern Western culture. This turn did not happen immediately upon his 1974 retirement from decades of service in India and his return to his native homeland, England. He quickly was immersed in a variety of avenues of work, teaching mission at Selly Oak colleges in Birmingham, where he and Helen had settled in, reading for the first time Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics all the way through and from back to front. Ask about that later. Summing up his mission theology in the Open Secret, preparing a commentary on the Gospel of John, The Light Has Come, writing an autobiography entitled Unfinished Agenda, engaging in debates about the local syllabus for the teaching of religion in the public schools of Birmingham. Then came 1983. In his updated autobiography, Unfinished Agenda, revised in 1993, a single final chapter was added to the original 1985 edition, entitled simply Postscript 1982 to 1992, and what a postscript this was. There he chronicles the origins of this something entirely new, as Beebe called it, this major innovation in the practice of mission, as I am calling it. A gathering of distinguished Christians came together for a day at one juncture in 1983 to reflect on the state of society and church in Britain. At the end of the day, it was decided to host a conference about the issues being discussed. It was to be held the following year, 1984, evoking, of course, the shadow of George Orwell's novel by that name. A committee was appointed to prepare the conference, and NEWBIGIN was to be included on the committee. He missed the first meeting, but arriving at the second meeting a month later, he says he was dismayed that there was already a draft program for the conference ready to be discussed. He writes about it, "I was very unhappy about it, as I did not think it began to deal with the underlying issues. I did not have the courage at that moment to question it, but when I went home, I phoned another member of the committee and told him of my feelings. He encouraged me to challenge the proposed program, and at the next meeting, I did." Basically, NEWBIGIN suggested an alternate plan to first focus the issues with some written piece, then commence a multi-year study program, and then host a conference to take up the fruit of the study process. NEWBIGIN again describes it this way: "The committee was generous enough to accept my suggestion, agreed to postpone the conference, and instructed me to write a pamphlet raising the questions that need to be discussed. 3 weeks later, I sent the results of my scribbling to Philip Morgan, the convener of the committee. Together, Morgan and NEWBIGIN sought comments and suggestions for improvement from 25 or 30 people, and after making some revisions, it was published as The Other Side of 1984, Questions for the Churches. First published by the British Council of Churches in a small quantity, and then picked up by the World Council of Churches with appropriate caveats about its distinctly British context and focus. The latter quickly sold 20,000 copies. The process began to move forward, NEWBIGIN describes, as the 1984 project of the BCC. A team of leaders for the project was recruited, including recently retired Dan Beebe. A study process was designed and commenced, and a date was set for the conference, 1992. Once they got rolling, they changed the name of the program to The Gospel and Our Culture, a program of the British Council of Churches. A little later, the British and Foreign Bible Society approached the leadership and offered to partner with them with personal and financial resources, which had otherwise been in short supply. All of this plan was completed on schedule. In many ways, the vision called forth as NEWBIGIN wrote The Other Side of 1984 would fully occupy the remaining 15 years of his life. His gaze had now been turned in a new and to him compelling direction. That is, the specific application of that missionary angle of reflection he had so clearly developed, and now turned upon the Western culture, which was his own culture of origin and his home in retirement. Having been invited to deliver the March 1984 Warfield Lectures at Princeton Theological Seminary, NEWBIGIN says he decided to use this invitation as an opportunity to develop more fully the message of The Other Side of 1984. The lectures, published in 1986 as Foolishness to the Greeks, did just that. Here, the vision and agenda are carefully and deliberately played out. This book was and still stands as the determinative declaration of the missionary encounter he envisioned, and thus a clarion call to the churches throughout the West to join themselves to it. All else, I suggest, flows from this book. A doctoral student at Princeton at the time, I was present for the lectures. I marveled as I listened to the first lecture, which is chapter 1 in the book, as he succinctly in a few moments and on a few lines of text introduced the heart and soul of the vocation of cross-cultural mission, in which field I had been reading for a couple of decades by then. His simply stated exposition was true to what I had come to recognize in the discipline, even if, I would add, relying on the Random House Dictionary to define culture. His definition went way beyond it. In those moments, he was turning our mission vision on its head. He was describing what cross-cultural missionaries from the West do when they work in other parts of the world. He was inviting us to turn that back on ourselves. He was describing what they do there in order to turn it back on ourselves. He was inviting us, too weak a word, to welcome that same kind of missionary encounter of the gospel with our own Western culture. If I might rudely paraphrase Jesus for a moment, do not missionize, lest you be missionized yourself with that missionizing with which you have missionized others. Why do you see the syncretism in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the logjam of syncretism in your own eye? A fair summary, I think, of his point. One of his opening gambits in the book drives home what is at stake. On page 4, which I suspect for a lot of readers is a place where they're called up short a little bit. Neither at the beginning, he says, nor at any subsequent time is there or can there be a gospel that is not embodied in a culturally conditioned form of words. The idea that one can or could at any time separate out by some process of distillation a pure gospel unadulterated by any cultural accretions is an illusion. It is, in fact, an abandonment of the gospel, for the gospel is about the word made flesh. Every statement of the gospel in words is conditioned by the culture of which those words are a part, and every style of life that claims to embody the truth of the gospel is a culturally conditioned style of life. There can never be a culture-free gospel. On this premise, all that follows in the book either stands or falls. Newbigin's next major contribution to this conversation was the gospel in a pluralist society. This is important as a sequel to Foolishness to the Greeks, but may in fact have become for many people the dominant port of entry into Newbigin himself and into his gospel and Western culture encounter. Accessibility is one factor, perhaps, but beyond that, I believe it is because here Newbigin is—
Hello there, my dear.
I don't know. Okay, that has passed. I believe it is because Newbigin here is doing what Foolishness to the Greeks was calling for. Here he is gathering a lifetime of missiological insights and using them to help people do the actual engagement with post-Enlightenment culture. The reader is taken on that journey with him. Shortly after finishing my doctoral dissertation, which focused on Newbigin, I was participating in an American 8-day-long ecumenical mission consultation on Common Witness, one of 110 Roman Catholic, conciliar Protestant, and independent evangelical participants seeking greater partnership in mission. Some of you in this Zoom meeting may have been a part of that as well. One of the themes identified for the consultation was faith in the context of modern society. Because of that, the organizers had invited Newbigin and his companion Dan Beebe to be at the consultation to speak to that theme. The conversations on that issue and on the Gospel in Our Culture initiative in the UK were very brisk. But on the last day of the consultation, the last great day of the feast, should we say, Leslie and Dan took 6 or 7 of us to a back room. They said to us, "We sense that you Americans like to talk about this issue. But what are you going to do about it on this side of the Atlantic?" we gave a collective, well, we don't know response. So much for pragmatic Americans. In the end, all we could agree to do was to stay in touch with each other about it. I went home with the job of putting out a simple newsletter to any who wished to receive it. The first couple of those were cut and paste, and that was not a computer term. That was scissors and Scotch tape. But that's how it started. We shamelessly took the name of the British program, and so the Gospel and Our Culture newsletter in North America was born. And with it, a North American network began to gather around the agenda. Thus, I was commissioned to become a servant of the grand innovation on this side of the pond, and the rest is history for another time. Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker. For the last 4 or 5 months, I have been immersing myself in all things Dorothy, reading things written by her and about her. I'm still finding my way in, finding my way on pilgrimage with her, as she might say it. Some of you know her work much better than I do. For our purposes here, I will touch on some of the features of her vision and work that suggest she has introduced an important innovation precisely in the practice of mission. I will allow Pope Francis to have the first word. In 2015, on his visit to the USA, Pope Francis was invited to address a joint session of the US Congress. His intention, he said to them, was to present some of the richness of your cultural heritage, of the spirit of the American people. And he wanted to express his desire that this spirit continue to develop and grow. He organized his remarks around several Americans whom he considered to be exemplars of our cultural heritage. From here, his comments. I would like to mention 4 of these Americans, he said: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. Taking them up one at a time, he noted that they contributed to our cultural, what they contributed to our cultural heritage and the ways that enables us to meet the present hour and its challenges. When he comes to Dorothy Day, he says, in these times when social concerns are so important, I cannot fail to mention the servant of God, Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic worker movement. Her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints. In conclusion of his address, he said, 3 sons and a daughter of this land, 4 individuals and 4 dreams. Lincoln, liberty. Martin Luther King, liberty in plurality and non-exclusion. Dorothy Day, social justice and the rights of persons. And Thomas Merton, the capacity for dialogue and openness to God. 4 representatives of the American people. A nation can be considered great, he said, when it defends liberty as Lincoln did, when it fosters a culture which enables people to dream of full rights for their brothers and sisters, as Martin Luther King sought to do, when it strives for justice and the cause of the oppressed, as Dorothy Day did by her tireless work, the fruit of a faith which becomes dialogue and sows peace in the contemplative style of Thomas Merton. Dorothy Day did not know what to make of that French peasant who had suddenly appeared in her living room in late 1932. A soapbox philosopher and visionary for reordering modern industrial society. Without introduction, Peter Morin had shown up unannounced at her apartment door, guided there by several people who suggested he should talk to her. His coat pockets stuffed with articles and books, he was ready to be the teacher of anyone who would listen. A bit hesitant at first, Dorothy listened, and as the next weeks and months unfolded, she welcomed his teaching as it filled a void for her, connecting the church's tradition, and particularly its social teaching, to her own deep-seated compassion for the poor. Just earlier, we are told by her granddaughter biographer, Kay Tennessee, she had visited the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., at a time when she felt at a loss about what she should be doing with her life, and found herself praying to the Blessed Mother, "Here I am. What would you have me do?" Within days, Peter had shown up at her door, and the conversations had begun. Tennessee writes, "The Blessed Mother, Dorothy believed, sent her a teacher, and those days of waiting and wandering were coming to an end." Within a few months, a lifelong vocation was coming to earth. The Catholic worker was about to be born. In the midst of their conversations, Peter uttered, often it appears, his program for the social reordering he envisioned. It had three components: roundtable discussions where there would be clarification of thought, he said; the establishment of houses of hospitality. He thought there should be one in every parish. And out of those houses, there would emerge farming communes, which he called agronomic universities. It was when Dorothy one time then asked the question, "How do we begin?" that Peter's answer came back characteristically curt. "The way to start is to start," he replied. "Let's start a newspaper." Dorothy's granddaughter, Hennessy, is quick to add, or at least that's what she heard him say. He hadn't a newspaper in mind at all, but broadsheets and pamphlets he could hand out while talking in Union Square. That verdict matches Dorothy's own comment about Peter's protest after seeing the first issue she had created, which was filled with articles about labor, strikes, unemployment, factual accounts, columns, features, in addition to half a dozen of Peter's own little easy essays, as they came to be called. Dorothy's long-standing, semi-submerged journalistic instincts and talents just flowered to life. That first issue of the newspaper, The Catholic Worker, appeared in May 1933. The paper was sold for a penny a copy. It still sells today for a penny a copy. And if you would like to order it, I was just told that for 25 cents, I could cover not only the charge of the 7 issues a year that are being published now, it would cover the mailing expense. No better deal on earth, I think. Issues followed on a monthly basis at that time, with 1 month off each year. The 4-room apartment where Dorothy and her daughter Tamar lived served also as the headquarters for the editorial work of the paper. Day, the journalist, was not only the paper's creator and editor, but she was its regular writer. Her columns were the sustaining heart of the paper and the movement it nourished. In them, she was doing a variety of things, chronicling the invisible lives of the poor and the worker, employed or unemployed. Remember, this was one of the cruelest of years of the Great Depression. Chronicling the events of the day that affected the poor, for good or for ill, and nurturing a Catholic Christian faith fitted for the industrial age. In all, she navigated onto the streets at least, I calculate, 500 issues of the paper until her death in 1980. And that's a lot of columns. The Day apartment, having already done double duty as the editorial headquarters for the Catholic Worker newspaper would soon become also a house of hospitality. Without pre-design, it would appear. A knock at the door, a simple response to a presenting need, and before long, an early morning bread and coffee line stretched for blocks. Meals were prepared and shared, donated clothing dispensed, and beds squeezed in here and there. As they reflected later, so many come that it is impossible to give personal attention to each one. We can only give what we have in the name of Jesus. Thank God for directing our vocation. We did not choose this work. He sent it to us. That is the way hospitality happens. Hospitality for Day and the Catholic Worker was as simple and profound as doing what Jesus says. The foundation for their ethical vision and response lies in the expressed and implied teachings of Christ. Day summarized the clarity that brings. Christ commanded his followers to perform what Christians have come to call the works of mercy. Feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, sheltering the harborless, visiting the sick and the prisoner, and burying the dead. Surely a simple program for direct action, and one enjoined on all of us. And how opposite a program this is to the works of war. Now, if that isn't the practice of mission, then I can't imagine what would be. Pause for a moment on that phrase in her rendering of Matthew 25, sheltering the harborless. The poor on the streets are not merely what we might call them today, homeless, lacking things like a roof, a bed, and a blanket. They are without harbor. Day instinctively, I believe, uses here a warmer, more feeling image that catches the emotional and spiritual experience of someone on the street and the needs they carry as they knock on the door. No safe harbor, no mooring against the winds and the currents, no rest from the day's journey, no one to share the journey with, no harbor from which to set out fresh the next day. The word harborless itself expresses a depth of empathy born, I believe, of Day's lifetime of voluntary poverty, life with and for the poor. Notice also Day's footnote on the Matthew 25 works of mercy, how opposite a program this is to the works of war. Here is a clue to her long contention against making war and using violence. At the very moment the US was entering World War II, she would declare, "We are still pacifists. Our manifesto is the Sermon on the Mount," which means that we will try to be peacemakers. Clearly, something greater than the initial sketch of a plan of action emerged through it all. Day says in 1960, "We are publishing a paper in which ideas are discussed and clarified and illustrated by act. So we are not just a newspaper, we are a revolution, a moment, a movement," as Peter Marin used to say. "We are propagandists of the faith. We are the church. We are members of the mystical body. We all must try to function healthily. We do not all have the same function, but we all have a vocation, a calling." There is in these words an implicit ecclesiology and missiology at work. The laity is the church. They are its propagandists of the faith. They have a vocation, a calling. Day elsewhere affirms this sense. The voluntary apostolate was for the unwilling celibate and for the unemployed, as well as for the men and women, willing celibates, who felt that running hospices, performing the works of mercy, working on farms was their vocation, just as definitely a vocation as that of the professed religious. Or again, in one of her columns, a column entitled "Our Brothers the Communists," 1949. How can the communists hear unless we take seriously our lay apostolate and answer them when they speak to us? The Catholic worker has served, I believe, to animate the lay apostolate. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says this and much more with it. The laity have their own assignment in the mission of the whole people of God. Through the years, the goal of the Catholic worker movement remained steady: to realize in the individual and society the expressed and implied teachings of Christ. And its fundamental means were these, said Day: voluntary poverty and manual labor, a spirit of detachment from all things, a sense of the primacy of the spiritual, which makes the rest easy. His praise should be ever in our mouth. Certainly, there were others who joined Day in this innovation in the practice of mission called the Catholic worker. Even the catalytic role of Peter Morin, however, does not deter observers from seeing its genesis and genius as Day's. Mel Peel finds it inescapable that the Catholic worker, and therefore American Catholic radicalism, was Dorothy Day's invention, and she pervaded its history. And Day's granddaughter biographer, Kate Hennessy, doesn't hesitate to call it my grandmother's creation, the Catholic worker, this physical manifestation of the mystical body of Christ. There we have them, three innovators. This has been the briefest of sketches to give you a bit of their stories and a taste of their invitation to fresh vision and action. May their innovations enliven you in your service to our Lord Christ. Which I conclude. I will entertain your questions with Ken's assistance, and I may even inject a few questions of my own to you who are in the gathered meeting.
Thank you so very much for such a wonderful presentation. Brief, punchy, and provocative. Thank you very much, and evocative of many questions as well from this good group. I'd like to begin by a set of questions having to do with translatability. And the first question from the chat box was, pertains to Islam's central text as untranslatable. The question is, how do we understand the views of some Muslims who may push towards an understanding of the Quran as translatable? This person was thinking of interactions that they have had with Ahmadi Muslims in the United States who have emphasized to this person their emphasis, that is to say the Ahmadi group and community, their emphasis on translation.
I'm very grateful that someone has added to the whole picture in that. I'm happy to hear of some of those dynamics that emerge even today on the ground in many situations. I'm reporting the logic that Lahman saw and the effect that it has on the way mission unfolds, particularly in his West Africa setting, with Islamic mission agents and Western European missionary agents, and the differences between those. This might call for some reinterpretation of some of that fundamental picture that he paints.
Yes, thank you. Another question then that relates to this: how would you and Professor Sane how would he, do you think, prove that translatability extends to every part of the scripture, languages, and even to the very words being read and internalized by vast numbers of cultures?
I'm not sure. The person asking the question might be able to clarify a little bit there. I'm not sure what exactly the question is about various parts of the scripture.
Well, yes. Okay. So the person who asked that question, if you could add to that, please. Another question, is this radical pluralism that Sane speaks of a gift of return to the diversity of the early church before the somewhat homogenizing effects of Constantine in the West and establishment elsewhere?
It has to be taken into that whole historical picture. I mean, even in the question, I hear the "in the West" comment, a homogenization in the West, which wasn't a full homogenization of all of the West and the East in its fullest domain, is what I would suspect is the picture there.
And then the subsequent question is, what about translatability of, say, early church councils?
I'll give my own perspective on it. I think Sane's basic theme emanates from that. The decision was, and he said it de-absolutizes as well as it destigmatizes. And there is something there that is confirming something of the Jewish tradition does not need to be part of how Gentiles receive this faith, circumcision, for example. But nonetheless, and Sane said this in one of my quotes there of him, that same dynamic called forth accent on that very original Jewish religious tradition. So that the council concluded some things that did not need to be imposed on the Gentiles, but it certainly invited the Gentiles to follow with some of the things that were part of that Jewish religious culture prior to that. Things strangled, etc.
Mm-hmm. In this, would you say that that the non-Chalcedonian churches have as large a stake and as rich resources as the Chalcedonian churches?
I don't know what might be hinted at there, but the questioner might want to enlighten us a little bit more on that as to the nature of that question. But I would suspect it has a bearing on all churches of all different types and locations in the world, finding a way for our communication and commonality to find expression. I don't find Sane speaking as much to that angle because I think he's trying to overcome the tendency for any sort of consolidation or any commonality to be defined by a major historic branch that wants its way to be imposed. And so I think he fights very hard on that side. But I think that kind of relatedness, the Catholicity of the church, is the other element that needs to come into play. The churches are various streams of the tradition.
Here's a question. How would you assess the strengths of the various traditions within Christendom to enter into these topics, Catholics, Protestants, Pentecostals?
I'm not sure I understand the nature of the question, unless it is simply to point out, I mean, those categories themselves, I and many of us are very familiar with because they kind of describe the landscape of Western European originated peoples, especially, but not entirely, who have found ourselves developing a name for different traditions of that sort. And those with the whole colonial affected missionary transmission has meant that they pervade other places too. we have pervaded not only our traditions, but sometimes our fights against other traditions. And that at least was something I perceived during my year in East Africa and learning about the African churches and some of the dynamics. I'm not sure I'd have anything to add to that.
Thank you. One person writes, in 1955, we had 35,000 international students and scholars, apparently in the United States. But today we have more than 1 million international students and scholars from 180 countries studying all over the US of A. What is the mission of the USA Church to these future leaders of our world?
If I go back to Sane's original sense of things, he would commend that fundamentally to notice the languages that are the vernacular spoken language and the cultural expressions of people, to have Bible translation available in their languages, and to be friends that come alongside that are willing to invite them into reading this message in their language so that it can spawn this expression of Christianity, Sane would say. And I think that might be something that commends itself. In one of the quotes that I used from Sane, it was the quote about a move from the missionary heroism and unilateral transmission to indigenous reception and appropriation. That shift in mission strategy is one that he said sort of in the tail end of reflecting on Azariah, the Indian assistant bishop, I think he was, who spoke at the Edinburgh 1910 conference. And his address was a short one, but it basically said, "Thank you for bringing this message to us. Now, we would like to have friends. Will you be friends with us?" And I think friendship has to play a big role in any kind of way of responding to the presence of international students. Now, the other problematic that engages, if they are international students in American colleges and universities, what is the going cultural frame of reference in which they're doing their studies, in which academe in general functions? So if you'd have to combine something of Sane's sensitivity to the vernacular and Newbigin's encounter with Western culture, of the post-Enlightenment culture, because both are going to be a part of the mix for students of that sort.
Thank you. There are two related questions that I'd like to link here, please. First, Newbigin and Day developed their theological understanding by making themselves vulnerable to the cause of the people of the margin, and in turn made to question the Western attitude of theological outlook. Is there any message from both of them that we miss in our current North American seminary curriculum? And then related to that, then, how would you put Dorothy Day, Sane, and Newbigin in dialogue with one another? What questions might they ask? What ways do their approaches to mission and missiology, whether they would accept the terminology or not, how do they cohere or how do they diverge?
That's really the question I was thinking to put to the whole audience that's on the Zoom meeting. And maybe there's some others that would like to pick up on that and offer some suggestions about what you're hearing in each of them that might give a sort of picture of that. My first response is simply that there's a very deep sense in which Sane and Newbigin are two sides of a coin. Sane working at the end of the indigenous appropriation of Christianity elsewhere, Newbigin challenging the absolutizing of Western culture for the church and its theology.
Mm-hmm.
So those two have that kind of dynamic. I think Day, who does not work in those kinds of statements, those kinds of summary generalizing statements. His writing so rudimentarily out of local, tangible presence with the poor, that it raises the question about all of our other reflections. I expect that is the one that is the hardest. If we take her voluntary poverty as a model, she talks often about the things that it means giving up and letting loose of, to not lay claim to things. She says, for example, every house, quoting early church fathers, every house should have a Christ's room, meaning this is for Christ, who will appear at your door as the poor. That is Christ appearing to you. And we should have a room ready. And then she says, in similar fashion, the coat, the extra coat on a hanger in your closet belongs to the poor. The way in which her life, character, and sense of hospitality emerged, to me, sharpens the edge of the question of the ultimate consequences of the way Western thinking and Western culture manifests itself, and the way it clouds us from seeing Christ in the poor. So that to me adds an element that addresses the whole complex of the thinking we do with friends such as Wyman and Leslie. Dorothy now lives something more rudimentary that is, I think, in every respect called for by the other two. But she is the one who has especially lived it in a way that enlivens our imagination.
Thank you. It would seem as if this provocative integration that Dorothy Day offers coheres with one question here. Today in the US of A, we have 50 million US citizens who live on the poverty level or less, and the US political system will never touch that group and is silent as this missional moment.
Yeah, it begs the question, it is silent. Is that talking about political operatives? Is that talking about governmental systems? Is it talking about cultural ethos? And then which parts of the cultural ethos is it about? I agree that there are things that move our cultural dynamic in a direction that keeps such folks invisible to us, and that there are ways they don't count as much as others. And I feel that very deeply. I feel implicated in that issue. But there are differences in the American population. So if it's a statement about the American population, it's a mixed bag. And there are movements, there are things afoot that say these works of mercy are to be ready at hand for the Christian. There is a move in Holland to welcome Afghani refugee families. And there have been other refugee families that have been welcomed into this community, not a large one, but a small mini city or mini urb territory. And it's happening across the country. There are things like that go in directions different from the political wrangling and policy making. But we live with a structure that has not been policy friendly to large swaths of the American population, the poor in particular.
Thank you. One good question, an additional question. Sane and NEWBIGIN spent significant amounts of their adult lives away from their birth nations. How much do you think this experience influenced their innovation and mission? And a related question, and both Sane and NEWBIGIN made those international moves relatively early in their Christian journey. Is that a factor as well?
I think you have to read them in light of all the formative dynamics that have shaped their imagination. And that includes where they came from, which never leaves you entirely, but it includes where you have gone in the pursuit of understanding of that. Both of their what I've called innovations that I've seized on are things that emerged out of a life of experience, both in home country, away, and in Newbigin's case, back again. And so life experience of any theologian, of any Christian, has effect on the way in which we think and view things.
A question, could you say a little bit about the current status of the Gospel in Our Culture network, please?
Surely, there was a long history. I caught you up only to the fact that it did jump the Atlantic and landed somewhere in the US. There was a long history. That was in the late 80s. And I coordinated that group through many of those years in the 90s, edited the newsletter and so forth. One of the things that happened in the course of especially the 90s and into the 2000-aughts, the 20-aughts, there were publications in the Gospel in Our Culture series published by Erdman's in conjunction with the network. And in recent years, under John Frankie's coordinator leadership, that series keeps expanding. The early years, it had quite a number of volumes that were collaborative efforts and collaboratively written books. It's a difficult process, but it was nonetheless a key feature of how the American Gospel in Our Culture network functioned in the 90s and into this millennium. More recently, monographs of various sorts are being solicited and are coming out in that same series. And it's not only in that series that such things are happening. I think the influence has gone way beyond the bounds of what is simply calculatably in reference to that movement. The other major thing that has been happening now for almost 20 years is a regular and increasingly rigorous forum on missional hermeneutics that gathers biblical scholars for whom a missional sense of the nature of God and the nature, therefore, of the church and its mission, how they work in biblical interpretation in light of that kind of vision. So that forum has been meeting annually with several sessions each time at the larger SBL meeting, SBL AAR that meets normally in November each year. And even last year and this coming fall, we'll do that virtually. I don't know how you do that virtually with 9,000 academics, but somehow they make that work. But in the course of that, this forum has continually had momentum as scholars have influenced each other and shared their work in biblical interpretation in a distinctly missional way.
Thank you.
Those are the two things.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, please, and it's a big one. So could you comment on Dorothy Day and her spiritual formation alongside Marxists, and how to think about these things in relation to modern movements and growing sympathies, especially among young people, for Marxist ideas, or at least for class consciousness critiques, perhaps in connection with social issues like Black Lives Matter, or the continuing advocacy for LGBTQ and other issues?
Yeah, she's very aware, and even deliberately so, about her early life, in which, as a young adult, she lived in New York City, lived a bohemian lifestyle, so-called. I'm not sure all of what that exactly indicates, but there was a lifestyle beyond a lot of the norms of the society, and She was in a very literate community with some of the major authors of that time, and she was associated with people who, in the late 19 teens, for example, were freshly enamored with the Russian Revolution, and communist parties or agencies were developing in that particular time, post-World War I. She was a part of that, and in fact, she had two journalistic jobs in that period of time, both with communist periodicals. And she refers to herself later on in some of her writings as an ex-communist. And the basic take, I gather, that she's describing with that is that she came to the point of recognizing how much that lent to her and drew her into a fundamental commitment and compassion for the poor, the working poor, the unemployed. And so the worker name for Catholic Worker, the newspaper, comes out of that kind of accent. And she was the one that gave it that name. And it was sort of over against the other newspaper of the moment. It was the Daily Worker, a communist newspaper. She says later that the communists taught her to care for the poor and the worker in a way the church, as she had known it, never did. But she also, in her ultimate thinking about that background, would identify that the solution that those groups sought, revolution in more violent senses of that term, was not one that she joined herself to. And so it was on that divide that she moved a different direction. And she was influenced by a lot of things as she came to that moment in her life when she became a Catholic. It was not without some precedent of some church connection early in life, but it never was a solid one. And now she became a Catholic of the sort that makes every effort and every day goes to Mass in the morning. Now that itself as a discipline is a really large one. Some of what drew her to the Catholic Church also was reading some of the saints, particularly the mystics, and that deep love for God and that deep love for others in light of that love were very formative for her early on. And that continued to be the case throughout her life. But those formative things were very important. I still sort of have to wince on our behalf as churches to say that she learned something from the communists that we never seemed to get or offer her.
Well, with this, thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation and especially for the engagement in this question and answer period. Thank you. It's been my privilege to be part of this and to be part of this convening of Professor Scherer's students. I now turn it back to my colleague, Peter Bethany-Gamoni, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ken Sawyer, for filling the questions and sorting out the question. We really appreciate your leadership in that. Friends, it's almost time to say goodbye to each other. I just want to take a moment to record our gratitude to Dr. George Hensberger for this marvelous lecture, inviting us to think afresh as to what God is calling us today. Would you please join me in giving a hand of applause to Dr. Hensberger, please? And I also appreciate all of you joining us this afternoon. In spite of your busy schedules, you have taken time to join us. We sincerely hope this time together was a great time of learning and refreshing our memories and, affirming our call to be the missionaries in the world God has called it. And with that, I want to conclude the meeting, and you have a very, very blessed evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Checking out, I guess. 91. JD.
Thank you very much for this good back and forth on these questions. It's good. We got a lot of very good questions, substantive, and thank you for your readiness to engage with them.
Sure.
Went very nicely.
Oh,
Yeah, great job on the questions, George. You really, it came at you from different directions and very in-depth questions and that, and great job with all of that. Yeah, that's good. I really
They were not-
appreciated the lecture. Go ahead.
They were not particularly easy questions.
No, they were. No,
And some of them were beyond my capacities considerably,
yeah,
but they were helpful to
yeah.
point to some things.
But I think pointing to the importance of your lecture. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the chat itself, but I mean, the chat was loaded with all kinds of questions. I mean, your talk really generated a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been to these things before where sometimes you get meager response, not meager, I shouldn't say this, but few responses and things. But I mean, it was loaded with questions and very, very in-depth and insightful questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great job, Ken. And
Thank you.
filtering through those too. Yeah. Very good.
We'll see you all in a good time.
yeah. Thank you, Dr. Hansberger. I will respond to your question about publishing the article in Currents and Theology of Mission. That's one of the missions of Dr. Scherer, that it is get published in our journal, and Dr. Kenser has been doing a good job in editing it, and we will work on it, and I'll get that stylistic sheets to you.
Okay.
And thank you for being very gracious in accepting our invitation and doing it. And you have taken into depth. I think Lamin Sana, I always admire Lamin Sana's 1987 article. I always make my students to read that, Western mission complex, and how the stereotyping of mission as, agent that went ahead to destroy cultures and languages. So very, very enlightening kind of thing. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Scherer, that you are able to join us. So this is great. This is great. Thank you. This brings more fresh energy to us.
Thank you so much, George, and thanks to all of you who contributed questions.
All right. Then thank you all. Have a blessed evening. Good night.